Welcome to the Chicago Clojure Meetup. The topic of this presentation, this presentation is entitled Researching Third Way, Democratically Run Economies with ClojureScript. There's my website as well as the website of the Chicago Clojure Meetup. We are going to be talking about a lot of topics, basically not just that of the main topic at hand, that of computerized simulations of an economy. But because there's a whole lot of background knowledge related to this simulation that I feel should be explained in order to make everything clear about what we're doing and why, there's a lot of topics that we will be touching on. And here's a somewhat abridged summary of the topics that we will touch on. Yes, we will get to Clojure and ClojureScript. The presentation in total will be as follows. I've divided this presentation into 7 big sections. However, because there is so much there's a fair amount of background that I'm assuming that the audience, the typical audience member of a Chicago Clojure Meetup presentation would not know. I felt it fair to have to explain all of that from the very basic reasonable fundamentals about this. So that's why we are, even though this is a talk at the Chicago Clojure Meetup about Clojure and ClojureScript, only of these 7 sections, only 3 of them have anything to do with Clojure. So with that proviso in mind, we are going to begin, and we're going to start with a somewhat Clojure related story. The story actually has to do particularly with the conference known as Clojure West. This was a conference that was held on the West Coast of the United States and was one of the 3 major pre-pandemic Clojure conferences, along with ClojureCon and EuroClojure. And in late March 2017, it was held in Portland, Oregon. And I was lucky enough to be able to go. I was able to convince my employer that even though it was not terribly close to Chicago, I felt it was worth it and that they should pay my way to go. And fortunately I did. So I went and I took an airplane flight, Chicago to Portland, arriving at Portland International Airport, PDX. And while walking through the airport, after I deplaned and going on to get a taxi to take me to my hotel, I saw some of the ads that were in the hotel and spied an ad for Portland State University. And then I thought to myself, Portland State. I know someone at Portland State. I know my friend Robin. Robin's at Portland State. Oh shoot, I forgot to reach out to him before I came. I'm gonna see if I can dig up his email and ask if we can maybe meet up to chat and catch up. I had encountered and known Robin for a number of years before this conference. And I still had his email. Luckily enough, I was able to find his email and I emailed him. And luckily enough, we were able to actually meet during the conference. In fact, here's a selfie of Robin and I when we met in Portland in 2017. In fact, it so happened that I actually skipped the first session of the last day of Clojure West so that I could have breakfast with Robin so that we could chat and talk about things. And among the things we talked about was a computer related project that he had been a part of. And he asked me if I would be interested, and I said, sure. The result of that effort, after 3 years of work, culminated in this book, Democratic Economic Planning, a book that was published in July of this year, and for which 3 years worth of work, I don't know if folks can see this. If folks can see me, I'm actually holding a physical copy of the book. From Democratic Economic Planning. Robin wrote it. I, along with Robin and a student at Portland State by the name of Michael Weisdorf, had worked together for 3 years on research that was published in the book, and which is the main topic of this presentation. Chapter 9 of this book is basically a summary and cheat sheet for the presentation that I'm going to give here today. but it kind of speaks to the kind of chance contingency of events. If Clojure West had been in San Francisco or Seattle or Los Angeles, but not Portland, I would not have, or even if I had gone, I would not have been in Portland. I would not have been in Portland International Airport. I would not have seen that ad for Portland State. I would not have been reminded to reach out to Robin, and we would not have had breakfast and decided to renew acquaintances and collaborate on work that culminated in a book more than 3 years later. So we got lucky, and in fact, there was a whole sequence of lucky breaks, not the least of which was one final lucky break related to Clojure West itself. The Clojure West in 2017 in Portland, Oregon was the last Clojure West. The conference discontinued afterward. If it had been discontinued beforehand, that would have been yet another possible break in this chain of lucky events that culminated in the book, this chapter, and the work that you're going to see in this presentation today. So if I were to give a presentation, I'd be talking about something else. And the work that you see today may never have happened. So a lucky break and a lesson regarding the chance contingency of events, Clojure related kind of. The topic is that of economics, for which we are going to now shift, economies and problems. Paul Erdős was probably one of the leading mathematicians in the world. He was a 20th century mathematician who straddled, who actually traveled all over the world, worked very hard to make sure that he did as much mathematics as possible. To this extent, he traveled all over the world, and even at times and in places when it was difficult to do travel. He was also fond of talking about a lot of different topics and using a lot of like pithy aphorisms and sayings. One of his sayings or expressions that he was fond of using was that of referring to the main political and economic superpowers in the world in the 20th century, to which he referred to as Uncle Sam and Uncle Joe. Uncle Sam, of course, being a metonym or a byword for the United States of America, and Uncle Joe referring to Joseph Stalin as a metonym or byword for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the old Soviet Union. So he called them Uncle Sam and Uncle Joe, but he was referring to the main countries of the United States and the Soviet Union. But that kind of reference regarding Uncle Sam and Uncle Joe could also extend not only to those countries and their political spheres, but also their main economies, the main economic systems. In the case of the Soviet Union, that was communism, represented by the famous logo that was on the old Soviet Union flag of the hammer and sickle. And in the United States, and the sphere represented by the United States of that of capitalism, the universal symbol of which I hereby deem to be Rich Uncle Pennybags from the board game Monopoly. These two symbols represent two disparate economies to which we're going to now analyze. And our analysis will go as follows. Allocation, meaning who gets what? What's the basis for determining who gets what in each of these respective economies? And mind you, I'm going to be sketching these out in broad detail, mainly for interests of time, and also because these are very large topics. You can spend careers on them, and people have. But as far as what we're talking about in broad strokes regarding the system of allocation that is used in the capitalist system, that of course is markets. Within markets being a competitive realm where you have buyers and sellers, and prices of competition, and buyers and sellers are each trying to gain a competitive advantage over the other. In the case of the allocation system in the Soviet Union or in communist countries or in communist economies, the main system would be that of what's referred to broadly as command planning or central planning. You have some planning authority, it devises an economic plan for the entirety of the economy based on information it may receive, and then it delivers out orders that everyone then follows. So in broad strokes, that's the allocation system known as command planning or central planning that you would see in communist economies. The sovereign, which is referred to as that entity which really calls the shots within an economy. Within a capitalist economy, that sovereign is the limited liability corporation, an entity that strives to do something, usually selling stuff, and which has limited liability. That is, if something should go wrong, the participants in the corporation or the shareholders in the corporation do not have as great an amount of responsibility regarding what they may be held fault for. So that's referred to as limited liability. The limited liability corporation is your sovereign in a capitalist economy. In a communist economy, it's the command planning authority. In the old Soviet Union, it would be something like the planning authority Gosplan, which was the old authority that determined that figured out the command plan that the economy followed. That was the sovereign in a broad sense within a communist economy, whether the Soviet Union or other communist economies. Income, in short, how do people get paid? And we're not just referring to, well, I get a direct deposit in my Chase bank account every 2 weeks, not that sense of income, but here it's like, what is the remunerative norm by which people get paid? In the most abstract sense, what is the rule by which people get paid? In a capitalist economy, that is, in as succinct a way as we can as we can phrase, but still be accurate, it's market power and contribution of human and physical capital to output. So how much power within the market do you have? How much do you contribute to output, both with the result of your work as a human self and whatever other capital you may have or own as contributed to that output? That is what determines the basis of how much you get paid within a capitalist economy. Within a communist economy, the basis of income, that remunerative norm, is the contribution of human capital to output. So how much of that capital, the resources that you have to contributing to output, how much of that do you have and can you contribute to the output of a given economy? The more you have, the more you would get paid. That's income within these respective economies. The division of labor. How are any work that needs to be done would be divided into tasks. How are those tasks organized? Interestingly, they're organized the same way in both of these economies. They're both set up in a kind of hierarchical fashion, where a relatively small group of people will have a lot of tasks that are very empowering, very desirable, sometimes very technical, and a great many who don't. They aren't very desirable, they aren't very empowering, they aren't very fun. So it turns out that both of these economies in broad strokes share that division of labor. But it doesn't mean that these economies are perfect, far from it. They each had their own problems. In the case of the communist economies, they had a dictatorial dynamic. That is, the central command planning authority would give down orders to everyone else in the economy. Obedience and results would come up from everyone else. That was kind of a dictatorial dynamic and has been criticized as such, and rightly so, by critics of such systems. There's a monopoly of information by conceptual workers. That is, people within communist economies whose job it is to think, monopolize that information in order to give themselves an advantage within that economy, which is bad, and which means that that information couldn't be shared, couldn't be critiqued, and if problems arose, would be harder to try to correct. A valid criticism there, and a problem within this economy. It's inefficient for addressing human outcomes. Even though such economies were billed as being all about people, it did not do that very well, and has been criticized as such. It obstructs self-management. Self-management means that people have a say in outcomes that affect them. And such an economy, especially given that dictatorial dynamic, would not have allow for most people to be able to have a say in the current work circumstances in which they live or thrive. So that obstructs that, and that's bad. For a long time, there was this criticism, which is much more muted now, both with the passage of time and both with the advances of computerized technologies, that it was impossible to calculate. That is, trying to determine that the plan from a command planning authority for an entire large-scale modern economy is so big, is so massive, and for one entity to try to compute that all would be so hard to do, even if you had a lot of preferential advantages going your way, that it couldn't be done. That, not only because most of these economies have since collapsed, but also with the advances of tremendous amount of computing power, especially computing power that is more and widely available, this has kind of lost its sting, this criticism, that is. But it's still a criticism that has been leveled in the past, and we mentioned it here as one of the examples of what how and why such economies were deemed as problematic. But it doesn't mean that capitalism is blameless either, far from it. It has a degree of antagonistic roles. Within a market, as I mentioned, buyers and sellers are in a competition with each other and hence are in antagonistic roles. But it's not just that. You also see antagonistic roles in other parts of the economy, within a workplace, for example. That's one problem. Another problem is, speaking of workplaces, hierarchy within those workplaces, where within a limited liability corporation, you have a relatively small number of people who have really empowering work and a monopolization of information, but a lot of everyone else does not have a lot of terribly desirable or empowering or great work that they can do. So a hierarchy results, and this is one criticism, as has been leveled on communist economies, likewise on that of capitalist economies. There is no collective consumption. This is, by which we mean the economy does not account for anything beyond the consumption values of the individual. It's individual buyers and sellers within the basic model of a capitalist economy, or within a market, that is the rule, and that's set up, and there is nothing set up for anything above that. So because of that gap, other entities, like, for example, governments, have to fill in, state-run not state-run economies, but the government and social spending, in order to try to provide some measure of collective consumption, tries to fill in that void, but that's basically a flaw of the fact that market economies don't account for that, and there's no collective consumption. Pervasive externalities, an externality referring to anything outside of the immediate transaction between a buyer and a seller to transact a good. If there's anything beyond that, like, for example, I don't know, if, say, a car dealer sells me a car and I use that car and I burn gasoline that then not only pollutes the air, but emits greenhouse gases that contribute to global warming that would eventually heat the planet to a point where it would be too hot to live, that's an externality. And that's not just an externality of this one particular transaction. You look across the economy, externalities are all over the place. And markets are completely anathema to trying to address that. As a result, they're pervasive. And that's been one criticism that's been leveled against capitalist and market economies. Because of that, that's one big reason why they're inefficient. These transactions would not account for these various actions within their respective transactions, and costs would not be accounted that would otherwise be costs. So, like, for example, the cost of me burning gasoline, the cost of the damage of me burning gasoline in my automobile is not accounted for in the cost of the automobile or the transaction. And that's an efficiency loss. And if you magnify that by every transaction across all things that an economy would do, that increases the inefficiencies and makes the economy, and has been a criticism of capitalist economies on the whole. Despite all these problems, and many more that could be leveled, a lot of people thought, and in fact, it was basically dogma, that this was all you could get. This was all you could have. You had to pick your poison. There was no choice here aside from these choices. You couldn't find anything else. The gauntlet for stating that was stated by a gentleman who it turns out had more of a straddle across these economies than most people would. The gentleman here, you're seeing a picture of a gentleman who was born with the name Alexander Novakovsky, and he was born in St. Petersburg, but who migrated to the West, settled and taught at the University of Glasgow, and took on the anglicized name Alec Nove. And he was an economist, in fact, also a scholar of the economy of the Soviet Union, arguably the leading scholar in the world regarding the economy of the old Soviet Union. And it was in writings of Alex in 1983, where he said the following: in a complex industrial economy, the interrelation between its parts can be based in principle either on freely negotiated contracts, that is markets, or on a system of binding instructions from planning offices, that is central planning. There is no third way. He laid the gauntlet down in no uncertain terms, summarizing the received opinion across the political spectrum and among theorists of all kinds of stripes, that you had to pick either of these systems, markets or central planning, command planning. There is no third way. Until there was. Robin Hahnel, the friend of mine who I met at Portland State, who I met in Portland and who was teaching at Portland State, along with a collaborator of his by the name of Michael Albert, who has worked as an author, magazine publisher, political activist, critic, has had a long career. Robin and Michael took up this gauntlet that there was no third way and proceeded to create a third way. They actually published their envisioned third way of organizing an economy in 2 books that were published 30 years ago. In 1991, they published 2 books listed here: The Political Economy of Participatory Economics, published by Princeton University Press, and Looking Forward, a book published by a publisher called South End Press, to outline, both for a technical audience as well as for a general audience, this proposed third way of organizing an economy that had nothing to do with either the old command planning or market economies that they had. The term, broadly speaking, of this kind of third way has been given the name democratic planning. So unlike command planning, where it's a single authority that commands how the economy is supposed to run, tries to make an economic plan, here it is different entities working together to devise a plan democratically, hence the name democratic planning. The particular model has the name, the specific model that they used of this kind of democratic planning has been given the name participatory economics. You could see that on the cover both of the books that were published in 1991. In recent years, the term participatory economy has been used to describe this third way of organizing an economy. So we go back to our slide here, comparing communism and capitalism, or markets and command planning. And we now make a third column, where we now, using the same criterion for organizing economies, now do the same thing for a participatory economy. We're going to be going from the bottom up for reasons we'll explain in a moment. Unlike the hierarchical division of labor that we saw in both capitalist and communist economies, participatory economies use what are termed balanced jobs. That is, that tasks are balanced across an economy for, well, a number of metrics: desirability, empowerment. Within the book that was recently published, Democratic Economic Planning, there's a proposal to actually include in other criteria, like, for example, caring labor. That is, if you are caring for an infirm person or for a baby, that should also be accounted for within jobs that are balanced, or work that is balanced. So this proposes a different division of labor than either of these other systems. The remunerative income, remuneration basis within a participatory economy is that of effort and sacrifice in socially valued labor tempered by need. That is, it is only the amount of effort and sacrifice that you do in work that is socially valued, that other people deem valuable, or that is needed. If in the event you can't work for various reasons, the economy would account for that, kind of like we do now in other economies. So that is also accounted for here within a participatory economy. The sovereign within a participatory economy are decision-making bodies generally referred to as councils. And we have two kinds, one that produce stuff, worker councils, and also councils that consume stuff on a collective basis, consumer councils. You can think of these as the equivalent of a workplace and, say, a neighborhood. Now, this is done in order to address the flaw within at least the capitalist economy that there is no basis for a collective consumption within a market economy. You've got individual buyers and sellers, and the economy doesn't recognize anything else. I mean, other things might account for some kind of social consumption, but within a participatory economy, that is built in with these institutions, these decision-making bodies that represent a group of people who consume stuff individually and collectively, a consumer council. The allocation system within a participatory economy has been given the name participatory planning. And this requires a bit of explanation about what this is. In fact, this is actually the main focus of the research of the presentation here tonight. Participatory planning, in very broad strokes, refers to obviously the non-market, non-command planning allocation system within a participatory economy. More specifically, and described very briefly, these respective councils, worker councils on the production side and consumer councils on the consumption side, each propose plans for what they want to produce or consume within some given time span, typically a year, for example. They then exchange those plans and then see if those plans match. If they don't, they revise those plans in a series of iterations with the goal of eliminating excess demand. Once the demand has been eliminated within this plan, you have an economic plan, and the economy can then carry out that plan to produce stuff and to consume stuff. The more detailed description of that, in working that out in as far as a procedure that can be coded, is as follows. Here's the list of those participants within a participatory planning procedure. Workers' councils, as well as groups of workers' councils, federations. Consumer councils, as well as groups of councils, consumer federations, as well as an entity that we refer to as the IFB, an iteration facilitation board, the very helpful descriptive term of an entity that helps to facilitate the iterations between these groups of workers and consumers and their respective federations. Their job is to help facilitate that. The procedure, given these players, is as follows. First, the IFB, the Iteration Facilitation Board, announces a set of what are called indicative prices, the best indicators of social and opportunity costs for all goods and services within the given economy. On that basis, everyone starts making plans and proposals that they then will submit to the economy for the actions they will take within that given time frame. Consumer councils would make consumption proposals for what they propose to consume within a given time range. Worker councils would make production proposals for what they propose to make within the given time range. If it turns out that everyone agrees with everyone, then we're done and we have a plan. But chances are that's not going to happen. If that doesn't happen, and it's quite likely that it won't, no problem. The Iteration Facilitation Board then adjusts the prices of those indicative prices based on the respective demands and supplies. The difference of that is called a surplus by economists. And then prices are adjusted up or down based on the positive or negative surplus between demands and supplies. On that basis of that information, the respective councils make their revisions, resubmit. If we're set, we're good. If not, then we go again and we repeat until there is no excess demand. And that's it. That's basically how, in some more additional detail, what a participatory planning procedure is and how it works. Robin Hahnel, in a book of his from 2005, summarized the situation after publishing this as follows. After publication, that is publication of the original model of a participatory economy, critics suddenly dropped the objection that participatory planning is technically impossible and instead raised new objections. So what are those new objections? Among one of them is what they call the practicality question. That is, how long is this going to take? That is, how many iterations would a participatory planning procedure require to arrive at a feasible plan? And that's a good question, and an important one, and one that should be answered to the extent possible. Kind of hard to try to do that without trying to take a guess. In some of the literature on this, they've actually outlined how that could happen, but it would be good to try to have this work out, and that's where computers can come in. So we work out an algorithm to be able to establish a participatory planning procedure with the course of investigating how long it would take, more or less. So we would try to simulate an economy with code, with consumers and producers, or at least with councils of consumers and producers, a worker council and a consumer council. That's our goal here for simulating that. The tool for doing that economists would use are functions, input-output devices, for both handling the production side and the consumption side. For producing stuff, that is referred to as a production function. For consuming stuff, economists refer to that as a utility function. And there are two mathematical tools that economists use and have devised to do that. Among the more well-known and well-studied such tools are referred to our class of production and utility functions that are called Cobb-Douglas functions. Charles Cobb was a mathematical economist and mathematician, taught at Amherst College for much of his career. It was at Amherst in the 1920s that he and Paul Douglas had done some research on figuring out the functions to determine the output of goods within an economy. Paul Douglas, I should mention, has had quite the career, as well as a number of Chicago connections. Paul Douglas, in addition to after teaching at Amherst, also taught at the University of Chicago, and then became a Chicago alderman. He was actually a representative on the Chicago City Council, 5th Ward, that's Leslie Hairston's ward. Paul Douglas was a Chicago alderman for 3 years. Then he ran for and won a US Senate seat. He actually served in the US Senate for 18 years. But it was his work in economics that we're going to be focusing on here, and particularly the work that they collaborated on in their production and consumption functions. We'll first look at the production function in Cobb-Douglas, that Cobb-Douglas had devised in a simplified abstract form. And it looks like this. That's neat. What does that mean? Well, we'll spell it out. Y in this equation refers to the output. What do you get out? What you put in are a number of things. L, the labor input, the labor that you enact for doing something. The capital input, the resources that are used for that. Alpha and beta as exponents refer to the output elasticities. In economic speak, an elasticity is a measure of how a change in a price affects the supply or demand for a given good. So it's a relationship between price and the supply or demand for a given good. That's referred to as an elasticity, and they are respectively used for as exponents within this formula for each of the respective inputs in labor and capital. The capital letter A refers to the total factor of productivity, which is another way of saying everything else besides labor and capital that can go into the output. That's handled by a single variable here that we call A, and that is referred to as the total factor of productivity. So you simply plug these numbers in, given the respective inputs, and out would come Y, the output. We adapted this for a participatory planning procedure as follows. The form looks a little different, but it's more or less the same idea. To explain what this means, instead of Y, Z is our output within this production function. X refers to the set of intermediate goods. An intermediate good is some good that is produced to make other goods. A canonical example is steel. that's used for making an automobile. You're not making an automobile, you're making the steel that's used to make the automobile. That middle thing is referred to as an intermediate good. So we would account for that for this simulation. So that's what X means, the set of intermediate goods. R refers to the resources available within an economy, the natural resources. L refers to the kinds of labor that are available within a given economy. E refers to the effort level within a given, in this case, worker council, because we're dealing with a production function. We're going to be dealing with producing stuff. There will be effort involved in. E handles the effort level. A, B, C, and D are the respective elasticities. That is the measure of how changes in the price affect the supply of demand for a given good. Those are exponents, just like in the formal description that we saw before. This handles that description here in our adapted production function. And Q is our total factor productivity. That's the variable that handles everything else that isn't handled by the respective intermediate goods, resources, labor, or effort. And with that, we can now compute the well-being of a workplace. That is, we're not just interested in trying to figure out how to produce stuff. We also want to make sure that we're accounting for the people involved with it, and to determine that those workers' needs are accounted for. And so this formula is used here for computing that well-being. You have a well-being equation that takes 4 inputs: the intermediate resources, natural resources, kinds of labor, and effort. Oh, that's fascinating. I gotta, no, I am not interested in snoozing. I got prompted for a Docker download. That's embarrassing. Anyway, as I was saying, well-being, this well-being formula takes as input the intermediate goods, natural resources, kinds of labor, and effort, as well as their respective elasticities, and a total factor of productivity, but also we're including in indicative prices. You'll recognize this as being the determination for determining the output of a good, figure out its price, subtracting the sum and respective prices of each of the kinds of intermediate goods, natural resources, and labor. Multiply those by each of their respective prices, add them up, subtract the sum from the output, and then from that entire quantity, subtract the effort and its respective elasticity. And that is what's posited as the well-being function of a workplace. And it kind of makes sense. What you get is output, and accounting for all the things that might be against that, with a particular focus on the effort involved. Turning that mathematical equation into code delivers back some, or at least can deliver back some pretty naughty code. I got a screenshot here of the Wolfram language. If folks here are familiar with the Mathematica programming language, the Wolfram language is the rebranded version of that. Wolfram referring to Stephen Wolfram, who was the founder of Mathematica. And there's actually another Illinois guy. They're based in Champaign. We've used the Wolfram language to solve these equations. You can actually see, if you can look, might not be the easiest thing to see, but you can see the equations, and you'll notice the variables here, and they match out with the formula that we had just described. We've got Z, our output, a bunch of intermediate outputs. This assumes 6 intermediate outputs, as well as effort, putting them into a variable, computing the derivative, because we're trying to maximize the well-being. So a derivative function calls in the being. D, capital letter D, is how you compute a derivative. And then we're using the Mathematica function solve to solve the equations for computing out the respective prices, given these respective prices, accompanying price coefficients, and output, as well as the effort involved. Compute out the equations for determining bars, which is, again, the output, the intermediate products, and the effort involved. When you actually run this code, you get output that is, to put it mildly, complicated. This is too small to see. And the point isn't to show it, because the mathematics about this is, even though the individual functions are simple, the aggregation of them can be very complicated. And remember, this is just 6 variables. If you kept going up, this just gets longer and longer. It's so long, it can't even fit on the screen in this, the smallest font size I could give. So it could still deliver that. Not to be daunted by this, but nonetheless, this is what we're seeing in the course of turning that mathematics into code that we can then program with. Moving on to the utility function, that is the program handling the consumption side of things for simulating a participatory planning procedure. I'm happy to say that it is much simpler. That's it, 2 variables. To describe what this means, Y1 and Y2 refer to public goods and private goods. And you're basically just multiplying them and their respective elasticities together, and that's your well-being. And that kind of makes sense. It's like in a consumption, when you're consuming stuff, that's an inherently thought of as good. So you're just taking all the private goods that you got and the public goods that you consume and multiplying them together with one constraint. The Consumer Council's income has to be equal to that of the respective prices for the respective goods consumed. That's another way of saying you can't spend more than you have. And so we account for that within this formula and within the model. Given both of these equations, the algorithm proceeds as follows. And this is what we're going to turn into code. 1, we load the worker councils, consumer councils, how those are to be defined, and I'll show those in a moment, as well as the indicative prices within an economy into memory. 2, for each worker council, we solve its optimization problem. That is, we take the latest indicative prices and then output it and update the output, the effort, and the demands for the inputs based on those latest indicative prices. Same thing, kind of, for a consumer council. We're solving its optimization problem. Given the latest indicative prices, update its demands for public and private goods. Step 4, we then calculate the new excess demands for all goods. That is, if there's going to be a mismatch between, we figure out what the mismatch is, if there is one, between supply and demand for all goods, all natural resources, and all categories of labor within the economy. And then we apply a price adjustment formula, which we'll see in a moment, to update all of those indicative prices. Step 5, we then take our counter and add 1 to it. So x equals 0, you're just simply applying a plus function. So that gets increased by 1. We then check, are all those excess demands met? In other words, do they fall within a given specified threshold? That threshold could be 0, but it might not be, as we'll see later on. If they fall within that threshold, we stop and we're done. If we're not done, that is, if we don't meet that threshold, we then go to step 1 of the algorithm and we repeat until we do. That price adjustment formula that I alluded to a moment ago, at least to what we determined to be reasonably effective for the model of the code that we had published and which is going to be presented here in a moment, is as follows. Looks like this. What does this mean? W refers to the percentage change in the price of a good for the next iteration. That's what W is. And we use V as well as this pricing formula for determining that. That is, V refers to the percentage excess supply for a good in the iteration just completed. Excess supply refers to the difference between supply and demand. And that's referred to as V. There is one exception to that. If V happens to be greater than 25%, 0.25, then that coefficient is then defined to be 0.25. From some trial and error, we determined this to be a useful constraint to have to improve the algorithm overall. And so that's what we used for our research, and that is what we coded up and ran with. The first instantiation about this was not in Clojure, but rather in Netlogo. Netlogo is, as it bills itself on its website, a multi-agent programmable modeling environment with its own programming language, which you can download. In fact, there's a Chicago connection to that. It's maintained and developed out of Northwestern University. In fact, here is the website where you can go to the Netlogo site. You can download the software. You can actually now run the software in the web, as I discovered to my delight recently. And you can run your own multi-agent programmable models. They offer lots of examples. They offer a lot that has going for it. It's a very easy programming language to learn. It has a lot of built-in functionality. It's very easy to adapt. They've got scads of sample tutorials. So most anything in any field that you can think of, chances are someone's already built one, probably multiple tutorials for that work or endeavor. There's a lot of documentation. The website is immensely helpful as far as spelling out how things are, how things have worked, and also with maintaining that over time. So you can actually see the commands not only now, but for versions in the past. It's very easy to iterate. In fact, it's all about iterations, and that was another inviting feature about using Netlogo. In fact, that iteration tool has its own terminology within Netlogo. It's referred to as a tick. So each iteration is called a tick in Netlogo. So those are some advantages for going with it, but there were some disadvantages. Netlogo code is not locked into the Netlogo platform. The only way you can run it is with Netlogo, with a Netlogo platform. Now, to be fair, that's kind of emblematic of a lot of programming languages. Whatever language is kind of locked into its respective environments. Clojure being a rare exception in that it's much less so in that regard, but I think it's an exception to that rule. Here, Netlogo is locked in. It is strictly an agent-based modeling programming language, if you can call it that. It's not a general programming language, even though it's got a lot of functions that are used by general programming languages, but that's not what Netlogo is. And most critically, especially for the work that we're about to see, it doesn't very easily scale up. If we wanted to scale it up to like large numbers of entities to examine agents, that gets to be pretty hard, and you push the limits, especially if you want to really push the limits, the software buckles under that strain. And so that was a con. But nonetheless, there was an effort to code up this algorithm for outlining a participatory planning procedure. And the first attempt at that was what's called the Participatory Planning Procedure Prototype with 4 Ps. It was given the clever name PQuad, with an homage to Herman Melville. And here's what it looked like. This is actually a screen grab of that aforementioned new web interface to Netlogo. I took the Netlogo code that was coded for PQuad, loaded it up, and it looks like this. This has a lot of functionality here for setting up, for running iterations, for various functions regarding prices, a whole lot of stuff regarding examinations, also handling the speed within an iteration if you want to go slower, if you want to examine more closely, or faster if you want to really see what will happen very quickly. There's a lot of functionality that was here, but as we said, there were issues with regards to general applicability and in particular scaling, both in terms of the number of available goods within the economy as well as the size of the economy itself. Here we needed to shift, and guess what programming language we shifted to? Clojure and ClojureScript. Why did we switch to Clojure and ClojureScript? Well, I'll mention a little bit of selfish reasons for this. For me personally, because I was doing a lot of the coding for this, not all of it, but most of it, I wanted to reduce the mental overhead. I found myself, because even though I can follow Netlogo, I found myself having to relearn it and refollow it in detail all the time. And I found myself, rather than working with code and trying to get code to work, I found myself having to redecipher Netlogo all the time. So for me, that was a big motivation to switch to something that I had a lot more familiarity with. And so reducing that overhead proved to be advantageous. There's greater flexibility there. Since Clojure and ClojureScript are general programming languages, potentially the sky's the limit for what we would want to do. And that proved to be handy later on, as we'll see later on in this presentation. And I just thought it was more fun to code in Clojure and ClojureScript than it was in Netlogo. So I decided to rewrite the app first as a Clojure app. In fact, this is a screen grab of the GitHub repository for a first attempt at PQuad in Clojure, named PQuad CLJ. And this had some success, but it also had some failings in that I found it very hard to try to iterate development. That is, I wanted to be able to very quickly update things and see updates happen faster than I think Clojure could accord. And so after working at this some, I then put it aside for a bit, and then I came upon thinking to myself, what could I do to speed this up? What would work? ClojureScript. Turn this into a web app. That way I could see the code, I could interact with it, it could run much faster, I could see those interactions within a browser, in fact. I wouldn't have to necessarily just compile. And also you can use the compilation tools within ClojureScript, Figwheel, for example, to really quickly iterate and improve on development. And that's what I did. In fact, we are now at long last going to see code. So to walk through what we've got here, this is an Emacs session that I've divided into two panes. On the left is a sample consumer console, and actually one of a set of consumer consoles, CCS, and it's defining a variable CCS that is a list of Clojure maps. Each of these is supposed to represent a consumer console. Likewise, worker consoles, WCS, but also a list, or in this case, a vector of Clojure maps. To describe a little bit of some of the values here. Some of these are self-explanatory. Effort, income. These are indexes regarding the particular demands that are consumed, public good demands, and final demands refer to the private good demands. There are also the exponents within that Cobb-Douglas function. So these store and are randomly generated various exponents within that Cobb-Douglas function, the elasticities for both consuming private goods and consuming public goods. For a worker console, again, some of these are self-explanatory. Effort is a reference of measuring out that effort level. Industry is just a number, and we're counting three types of industries that we named 0, 1, and 2. 0 and 1 being private good industries, that is, they produce private goods that people consumed. And industry number 2 was public goods. It consumed public goods. Output is pretty self-explanatory. S refers to the coefficient of the disutility of effort. You remember in the adaptation of the Cobb-Douglas formula, we've got the effort, and it's got an elasticity, an exponent. That's what S refers to. Excuse me, S refers to the coefficient, not the disutility. Du is that the exponent of that. But both of these are variables that are used in the effort value. Disutility of effort, and S for suckiness of effort, I was told, is what it's supposed to stand for. The kind of product that's being determined here, and there were a number of products that were produced, again, just a simple number. The respective production inputs, again, a vector of vectors that are just each of the respective intermediate goods, natural resources, and labor, and they're basically just random subsets of sets of numbers. And this particular worker console had 2 intermediate goods identified by number 6 and 7, a single natural labor, natural resources that was available, number 8, and the types of indicative labor labeled numbers 1 and 2. You've got the respective exponents of those intermediate inputs, nature and labor values. A refers to our total factor productivity, everything that's not capital or labor going into that. And so these were just maps, sometimes a lot of maps in one vector that could be very big. Moving on. It was a single global variable, as one big atom that was used for this. And in fact, it basically listed everything that we used in the economy in the simulation in PQuad CLJS. There's respective prices for the 5 categories that we accounted for: intermediate goods, private goods, natural resources, labor, and public goods. We're each given an arbitrary value of 700. We accounted for 10 of each of those kinds of goods, which you could see listed here for private goods, intermediate goods, public goods, resources, natural resources, and kinds of labor. We list out the prices. We list out the surpluses. We also have some other metrics here that were useful. Threshold for tracking if we reach a certain given percentage. If we get to 0, that'd be great. But if we got to some sufficient percentage, that was deemed to be good enough. We also track the change of prices. Those are referred to as price deltas. And so we track those as well. We have, in fact, this is actually the same set that's actually moving down. This is actually the same big variable, but cut into a unlevel presentation here. So this is actually the same as this for the worker councils. But we list out a list, just a simple list of worker councils and consumer councils that we then load from memory and put into this very big vector. We track out the respective supplies. Here's our tick, our count of our iteration. It's also just a single variable that's counted. We also track out some other different variables here for determining out the gross domestic product within the economy. That is the amount, all the goods in the economy and all their respective prices and value all combined into one big variable. And does that improve or over time? Turtle Council here refers to, this is actually an homage to how Netlogo does it. Netlogo uses the entity of turtles as a synonym for their agents. And here we wanted to see individual councils within the course of the iterations. And so we determined that as a map that we refer to as a turtle council as an homage to that old code. Moving on. We run a setup function, and it's basically just associating that very big map with what you can actually see. We take the intermediate inputs or resources or labors, all the respective goods for a given T referring to that great big atom, getting out the number of that, incrementing it, and then getting a range of numbers that when put into a vector is just our list of inputs. That refers to an identifier for the category of each of the respective kinds of inputs. Different types of categories of goods and things available within our economy. We initialize our prices, which happens here, just simply taking out and repeating the number of respective goods within a vector for those respective prices. And then doing a great big assoc on a number of the different variables that are accounted for here. Here's where we actually assoc in the consumer councils and worker councils within the economy. This is actually done through a very long dropdown. I've actually reduced it a lot for the purposes of presentation here. In some of the experiments, we got to as many as 70 different experiments to choose from, and that's done there. This is one of the main functions for handling the consumption function. Excuse me, production function. It's a function called proposal that takes a given worker council, all the respective prices, and then extracts out from that council the respective variables that are used into it. So it's going to be, we're filling in that Cobb-Douglas function. So we can see the respective, and you can see some of them actually commented out here with some comments. The scalar for the production function, the respective coefficients, the elasticities, the exponents, the elasticities for the respective values. Get lambda O refers to the given kinds of prices. So for a given industry, determine its respective price for a given good respective to that. And then depending on how many individual intermediate goods we have, we then run one, or actually it's always one of these different solution functions depending on the count of the number of inputs that we have. I'm going to break for a moment to drink some water. That solution code looks like this. You'll remember back when we were looking at the Mathematica code and we were taking those kinds of equations that in trying to determine out the output, the effort, and the respective intermediate goods. This is that same code converted to Clojure and/or ClojureScript. This is actually ClojureScript. You can tell because math/PO and math.e. Capital M math is actually a JavaScript function for the math library doing things like a power function and the value E. You can also see logarithms. So there's a lot of logarithmic functionality that is used here. And that basically takes those respective inputs, plugs them in from these formulas to compute out, get their respective outputs, reallot the number of those respective outputs in order to keep the values consistent across intermediate outputs, natural resources, and labor, and then reassign them to a map that's then returned back to associate back into the the worker council once the computations are completed. And this is just one of 6. We had 8. We could handle up to 8 intermediate goods within an economy. And we actually have code, although I'm not going to show it in this presentation, that can actually scale up to as many intermediate codes as we want. The formula to compute this is very regular and hence computable. Probably could be computed as a Clojure macro, but in keeping to the scale of the research that was done here, we limited it to 8 intermediate inputs. Moving on. This is the whole, all our consumption function is handled by this one function, and it's just simply named consumer. You take a consumer council, the respective public and private goods, the respective public and private good prices, and this is basically you're mapping across those. This is a map V function across those lists of private goods. For each private good, you're basically taking that respective private good, that respective exponent, the utility exponent for that respective good, private or public, multiplying it by its income, and then dividing it across all of the respective exponents for that respective good and their respective prices. And you're just doing the same thing for private goods and public goods. And the result is then associated back into actually right back into the council, no intermediate step required. So luckily the consumption stuff is mercifully much more simple than the production stuff. This is the equivalent of the iteration facilitation board within our economy. It's a single big function regarding updating surpluses and functions, updating surpluses and prices for our economy. That is, given the entirety of all the worker councils and consumer councils, the respective supplies, all the inputs, as well as the type, that is what you are actually getting the supply of, private goods, intermediate goods, public goods, natural resources, or labor. We actually set this up as a loop recur. So this is actually the same big function. In fact, you actually see the demand listed here twice. So what we do is we get out the supply for the given respective type, given the 5 types that are at play, compute out its respective supply, find out its type with a cond p value. So given a type, conditionally determine out what kind you are, compute its demand. We put them into values of supply and demand. We do a little bit of offset because it turns out that since these are organized in one big list, we have to offset in an organized list to account for that offset so we don't miscalculate. Surplus is just simply taking supply minus demand. And look here, our price delta, 1.05 minus 0.05 to the power 2 times the surplus times the plus the demand and supply. That's our pricing function. You remember that? W equals V, that's it, right there. Price delta to use. That one line handles the pricing economy, pricing function that we have here. In fact, it turns out to actually be much simpler than the older version that we had for that, where we actually conditionally iterated in a take while loop to actually refine the price vector, price adjustment amount down to a really small value potentially. So if it turns out it would, it's basically like you're traveling down the highway, but you're getting to an off ramp you don't want to obviously go full speed down the off ramp. You want to slow down. This is the equivalent of that kind of slowdown function. But, and it did the job, but it also increased the amount of iterations, which is what was important there. So we actually changed that. And that's what the equivalent is. The respective values, we then, on that basis, with that given new delta, we then recomputed the respective prices, depending on whether or not the surplus was positive or negative. And then we just adjusted it up or down based on whether it was positive or negative. And then simply put the values back in the beginning of a recur loop that then went back into the beginning of this loop. And then if it turns out we were done with all the inputs, we return back all the prices, all the surpluses, and all the respective change prices, the new deltas. This is the maestro of it all, iterate, plan. What we do is we take here's where we have our respective consume function and proposals for all the goods within, or excuse me, for mapping that for each of the consumer councils or worker councils, associating that result to our respective consumer councils and worker councils. Once that mapping is then complete, we then plug all those in as well as their all respective variables into the, where I can find it here, update surplus prices for each of the respective categories, updating private goods, intermediate goods, natural resources, labor, and public goods. They are each put into, and we actually have a destructuring bind here, where we're actually destructuring a map that's actually going on here. We have additional information to be able to determine back the respective lists of supplies, surpluses, and demands, price deltas, the threshold, counting up the threshold. These are basically statistics that will be were useful for determining what was going on in broad strokes, and we'll actually see some of that in a moment, as well as determining out the gross domestic product across two imagined years, year 1 and year 2, and computing those out with the helper function for computing that out. Once all those respective variables are done in a very big let bind, again, a very simple assoc in the modified version after we've completed those iterations of all the respective prices, surpluses, prices, surpluses, change deltas, price changes, that is, supplies, demands, thresholds, and other statistics. So this is our maestro iterating plan. Moving on. Oops, here we go. Since this was a Clojure script app, there's a little bit of web functionality that's going on, and we're seeing a little bit of that here. And since it's an atom, we're going to be using a swap function. So that given a set of globals, that's the name of the atom that's at play here. And then we just swap globals for a proceed function that we have listed here. Proceed calls iterate plan, which is what we just saw on the last slide, to iterate through a single iteration of the plan. Rest of to do is a helper function for some additional follow-up statistics and presentation useful stuff. One of those useful things is to show color of a threshold depending on how close you are for a given threshold. Here, we basically counted if all the entities within a given threshold category were at or less than 3%, they were colored red. Excuse me, they were colored a shade of blue. For within 5%, they were colored a shade of green, long green. Within 10%, they were colored yellow, but it referred to officially as gold. Within 20%, a shade of dark orange, and everything else was red. And we just simply defined red here, a shade of red. And it's just basically running a swap with the given click. And you can see the hiccup code that runs that code here for the respective buttons, clicking on that, running a swap, running this proceed function, and sometimes iterating multiple times, especially when we were doing exploration of seeing how many times it would take in certain experimental situations. We had examples where you could iterate 5 times, once, 5 times, 10 times, or 50 times. And we're basically just in that case, just simply doing another loop recur, just rerunning the same iterate plan over and over, keeping a counter in play. and just simply returning the result when that counter hits 0. That's it. At this point, what would the presentation be without demonstrating some code? So I am actually going to escape out of this at the moment, and I'm going to jump to Firefox and drink some water. Wow, I am talking for a long time. But actually, we're going to go through. We are going to run some code. So this is PQuad CLJS. So I am now going to load an experiment. So here's an experiment. So I've loaded in, I now can load in with the setup button, loading in 3,000 worker councils and 3,000 consumer councils. Here are the operations for iterating once, 5 times, 10 times, and 50 times. Here's that turtle explorer I mentioned. You can put in an ID and you can see the given stats regarding the explorer. The output would be returned here. You would push the show console to do that. We have an augmented reset that we use to simulate a second year in this economy, and also with some statistical finagling in order to simulate the economy going, to simulate the economy changing over time in a good way with the technological improvements. Once we've loaded that in, and we now see the respective prices, 10 of them for 10 goods within the private goods, intermediate goods, nature, labor, and public goods. The respective price changes. Since we haven't changed anything, there's nothing there. The starting points start at 25, the supplies, the demands, the surpluses. Here's that color coding that goes on for the percentage surplus. And then we also track the percentage surplus for the iteration previous to that. That proved to be useful in some research. So let's iterate. So we've loaded the data in, we iterate once. So we have now gone through a single iteration for our mock economy of 3,000 worker councils and 3,000 consumer councils. You can see that things change, obviously, with the respective prices, supply, demands, deltas, surpluses, and the threshold. The goal here is to go from red to green. Green, which represents a 5% threshold, is what we considered, at least in some of our experiments, to be success. I am actually going to resize that so we can see everything on a single screen. Okay, continuing. So iterate a second time. You can actually see the iterations listed here. We are now at the second iteration, and we've seen a lot of changes, but we haven't actually improved the threshold just yet. Continuing. Iteration number 3 now. Okay, where again, our goal is to try to get from an arbitrary price vector to we've agreed on a plan for the entire economy. Can it be done reasonably quickly? And aha, look, we have now changed. So now if you look, all the values, the surplus and supply, so it's the surplus value, supply divided by surplus, that ratio is then listed here. Is that percentage multiplied by 100 to give you a percentage? Is that all within, in this case, 10%? In this value, we will find that they are, but in all of these others that are red, they are not. So we will continue. We're now moving on to yellow. That's now a 5% threshold. And you'll note that they are all within a, 10% threshold. They're all within 10%, all within 20%. Red for the other condition or the else condition. But we're still not there for green satisfactorily. We will move on. We are now at iteration number 6. We have all reached all orange. That's neat, but we want green to get to 5% threshold in this example. So we will move on. Nice thing about color coding this is it's easy to see. At least I found it to be so. So we've got yellow. It's going from red to green to yellow to red to orange to yellow to green and ultimately to blue, but blue would be super good. We're going to suffice with green in this presentation. If we get to blue, that also counts. Moving on with iteration number 8, and we have reached green in both the nature and labor categories. You will notice that all these percentage surplus threshold met are within 5%. Within all these are at or better than 5. But that's not the case all here. We got one that's at 7, one that's a little bit above 5. So this is within a 10% threshold. So it's colored yellow as a result. But we want, again, to get to all green at least. So we continue on. We've actually gone back a step here, but not by much. There's just a single value here that is above 5. So continuing. And we're now playing musical chairs. Now public goods and private goods are within our desired 5% threshold. We're not quite there on intermediate goods. We got one outlier here, one for nature. We're very close though. And in just 10 iterations, we're very close to achieving our goal of, in this presentation, 5%. Oh, we're almost there. In fact, we're even almost there. There's just a single good that's not within the 5% threshold that we want for this single set of intermediate inputs, but we've achieved that for everything else. Will we get this with this single iteration? I'm guessing yes. Cross fingers, and we do. Excellent. So congratulations. We have now gone from a single arbitrary, an arbitrary economy with an arbitrary price vector, and in 12 iterations, we have achieved we have achieved the given threshold of 5%. But that's year 1, starting from a single arbitrary standpoint. We can actually reuse this set of all of this in a second year. And so that's what the augmented reset is. Some changes happen under the hood when I update this. What the changes that we actually have, we basically simulate the equivalent of a technological improvement. And we also reset our counter to 0. So we are pretending to be year 0 again. This is now year 2. We reset the counter to 0, but we start off with this given set, and we're now going to see, given the changes, do we improve on 12 iterations? Let's find out. We'll count with iteration of 1. And yes, we do. You'll recall that in our previous year 1 example, we actually got to red in what? We actually had red for like 3 or 4 iterations, but within 1 iteration, we're already at orange, yellow, striving for green again. And we're well on our way to doing that much more quickly after just a single iteration. We're getting closer there still. We're at yellow, shooting for green. So 2 iterations, we're very close. Let's see how we get continuing with iteration 3. Closer still. We're playing musical chairs, but we're getting there. 4 that are within the 10% threshold, 1 that is within the 20% threshold. Continuing, we want to press iteration 1, not 5 times. Oh, and it turns out we've actually done better. We actually now, you'll notice for all these percent surplus thresholds, we are now better than 3%. That's what blue means. And in fact, probably even almost within 1%. This is really good. But we're not there for the entire economy. We want this to be at least green or blue for the entire set of goods in the economy. So we're going to click again. Do we get better on that score? Almost there. We have now achieved the threshold we want for intermediate inputs. For private goods, we're getting close. We just have a couple of outliers within the 5% threshold. Same for, well, 3 here, 1, 2, 3 within public goods. Let's iterate again. Do we get there with iteration number 6? We do. In fact, we all received the three sets. So we actually shaved the number of iterations that we had from year 1, from arbitrary set, to then using the information that we had in our economy and rerunning that again with some resetting it, but also preserving the information and doing the mathematical equivalent of simulating technological improvements. And we're able to improve on that by half. Going back to our presentation, PowerPoint. That's good. When we presented the results of this to everyone else, that's really good. We could simulate what we were doing in Netlogo in ClojureScript. Now let's multiply that by 10. Don't just take 3,000 worker councils and 3,000 consumer councils. Let's make it 30,000 worker councils and 30,000 consumer councils and 100 goods of each different stripe. So, and also, by the way, don't just do that once. Do that 40 times. So, okay, we now have a homework assignment to try to do the same thing that we did in ClojureScript for one smallish example, but still fairly big and much bigger than we had done in Netlogo, bigger still. How do we do that? Clojure to the rescue. We want to go here. So we actually adapted, or I adapted the code that was used for the simulations in ClojureScript to Clojure. In fact, here is the code that you'll see. It's kind of small to read, but it's basically the simulated code, the code used for generating worker councils and consumer councils in bulk. What we're doing here is determining a set of values, getting random subsets of those values, generating exponents using a lot of rand ranges and rand functions that are used here, and then getting out a map that we then merge into a given simulated worker council. Same for consumer councils, given the respective values that are being put in for the kinds of goods, the kinds of intermediate goods, public goods, intermediate goods, and the number of worker councils you want, generate out the respective private good and public good exponents, map those out and put them into a map, and then generate them out at scale to be able to generate those out as 30,000. Now, mind you, this is, even though it's CLJS for this original generation, but for actually running the code, this now becomes Clojure land. This is now Clojure code. You'll notice gen.clj, csvgen.clj, and drinking some water. And this is what's beautiful about the ClojureScript ecosystem. With little more than just copying the code that I've written in ClojureScript into Clojure, with very little changes, very few changes, I can actually just rerun the code almost without any changes. But here, the point was not to run it as a web app, but to run the same functionality with much larger inputs and delivering the outputs as a CSV file to be able to digest into a spreadsheet of some kind. What we do here is, and we're basically, you'll notice the code here, we're running the same swap setup for a given globals variable with the globals atom that's fed in. Toothaches was our name for, in trying to test out, was our whimsical name for trying to basically break the system for mathematics. I'm blanking on the term for that. I have to admit, I don't remember the term for that. The whimsical name that we had for that was toothaches. It was basically an attempt to break the system, by messing with the given assumptions within the set of exponents within a given worker council or consumer council, and then printing out the results after they're computed, and then joining them all into one big CSV file, and then repeating after an augment takes place. So year 1 and year 2, but also in some attempts to try to break it and seeing what the result of that is. But the nice thing about this is that this was very little new code that was run in order to scale this up, and why the switching to Clojure and Clojure, the Clojure ecosystem, Clojure and ClojureScript, paid off handsomely. Scaling up for this took very little time, and frankly, not as much effort. The formal findings, after we ran through all these experiments, we scale it up to 40 experiments, 30,000 councils, 100 of each good, 30,000 worker councils and 30,000 consumer councils. Given all of that, what are the experiments, all these experiments, what are the findings? To go from that arbitrary vector, price vector, to a 5% pricing threshold from that arbitrary price vector took an average of 11.85 iterations. This is the simulation for that year 1 that we saw in the PQuad CLJS, the web app, getting to 12 iterations. Turns out that that averaged a little under 12 across all of those experiments. To go to a 3% threshold, that is, we want to go instead from arbitrary to blue instead of green, it took a noticeable number of iterations to do that, 19.2 on average. But to go to a 5% threshold, this is the year 2 simulation from the previous experiment's price vector, accounting for changes within the economy, for accounting for technological improvements and consumer preference index changes. The results on average were pretty good. 6.5 iterations. That's kind of like what we saw in the web app, where it ran for 6 iterations, as we saw. The GDP percentage increase, and we actually tracked that because we were interested in seeing how that fares out pretty well. As GDPs go, a value of 2.446%. That's the term I was looking for, increasing returns to scale. That's the term for basically saying we're breaking the system and we want to see if the code and the algorithm is robust enough to be able to handle it. And the answer is yes, it is. It turns out it actually improves it a little bit. The average number of iterations, 6.25. The GDP percentage, still a respectable 1.859%. So our findings were encouraging and solid and published, I'm happy to say. And they were published back in July. Chapter 9, as I mentioned, of Democratic Economic Planning goes through all of this and more in detail, including the full results of the summary that I just presented on the previous slide. If you're interested, that's there. The book is available now for purchase as in paperback, hardback, and as an ebook from Routledge publisher. Past this prologue. So to wrap up, where do we go from here? What are the future directions? And for this, I talk about it in terms of 4 broad categories, both in terms of the code regarding the PQuad, CLJS, and CLJ ecosystems that we've just seen, the overall scheme of the research of what the code is examining, what are the new directions in research that we can go from there, new possible projects, perhaps connected with this, well, certainly within the model of a participatory economy, but otherwise things that might be inspired by it, as well as some larger thoughts with regards to the future and the past. So with regards to code, what are the things we have to do for this PQuad code? Well, for one, there are, as you will look in the code, and I'll share the link momentarily, we want more automated tests. There are some, we want more, so add more. TDD is our watchword here. There's also more code consolidation. It turns out that because I straddled the ecosystem of Clojure and ClojureScript, it would make sense to have the code, some of the code is in a CLJC file that straddles both ecosystems. Not all the code is there, all the code should be there. It would be a good thing to have them both in there, both to simplify the code base as is and to make it friendlier to interact with for others. So that's one goal for a future direction. The code is not as Clojure. There should be more Clojure idiomatic code, more mapping, and rather than fewer loop recurs. And that's been one criticism of and other improvements. There's also a fair amount of redundancies within the code. The code could be improved just to follow more Clojure idioms. It's also in reducing some of the old Netlogo idioms. So that's another direction of research or advancements. I built it up as an atom for state change because I needed it to work and that seemed to work. But can we do it without atoms? Can we actually have them all be in state? And that would be nice because we could then do time travel rather than only going from one direction from the past to the future. If they're all in state, you can just move your way forward and backwards for a given experiment and given iterations. And by not having atoms, that could be possible. So that's one other thing. Developing this out as a research kit would be good. To some extent, that's already been done, but to be able to make it really polished could be a useful future direction for the code here. For the larger research directions here that are going on, see if we can do the same thing better besides using Cobb-Douglas. Cobb-Douglas, for all of its strengths, it turns out to also have weaknesses. Among them, it turns out that it generates constant elasticities of the demand for all goods. That is the price adjustments because of the supply and demand for all those goods are always constant within Cobb-Douglas functions. It'd be good to get functions that can handle differing elasticities, the different price changes. And so the idea would be to see if we can run simulations built from the ground up with different economic production and utility functions. We were winging it when we determined and struck on a reasonably good price adjustment algorithm. We should do a more systematic search to get and find better price adjustment algorithms. There is probably, as good as all this research is and has borne out, and the results seem to match up with what the theory predicts, we can probably do better still. And so that means searching for better search price adjustment algorithms. We would need to test this, the code, not just the code here, but the algorithm powering a participatory planning procedure more robustly. We've done that to some extent, but we really want to try to break it to be able to try to see if the algorithm can handle stress testing. So more robustness testing should be on the research horizon. Also, within the literature of a participatory economy and participatory economics, they talk about how in later iterations, people could get involved in order to help speed the convergence between within a participatory plan to go faster. So figuring that out, and where do at what point could or should humans speed things up? Human intervention research is another direction of research that should take place here. And one thing that actually got a lot of short shrift in this presentation, but is still very important, especially where we want an economy that can handle stressors regarding the environment. How well does this economy handle environmental impacts? By which we mean pollutants within the verbiage within economics. Can it succeed on that score? Can it converge as well? Can it also respect the environment, which our previous economies really don't? That's another avenue of research. Some new projects that could be in the offering that might be inspired by some of these economics works. One, educational tools. I know of one project that is out of the University of Arizona by one gentleman who I've spoken to recently, who has been presenting a classroom simulation of a very small simulation of a participatory economy using just two goods as a pedagogical tool to teach kids and students in economics classes how this could work. So some new educational tools specific for classroom settings could be a good project. Detailed simulations. This would be where, not just like the simulations that we've run here, where we're simulating the councils as agents, but like individual participants, you and me, would be going into a simulation that itself would be a detailed participatory plan and a participatory economy. That could be a very intriguing project with a lot of potential there. In fact, some folks out of London have been working on organizing a plan to try to make that happen. Along these lines, it turns out that I am also converting this into one or more games. I do know, because I'm friends with the guy who's doing this, that there is a computerized game that is doing just that, where a participatory economy is part of the equation regarding an economic simulation. So gamifying this is another possible project. Beyond computerized games or classrooms or simulations, can this be implemented in real life? That would be something to do, or could it be aided by computers in some way in real life, like with an app, for example, a cell phone app? That'd be another interesting and intriguing project. Could these ideas within the model of a participatory economy be used to apply for other uses? For this, the canonical example I bring up is that of Wikipedia. Wikipedia could be argued as that of an exemplar of anarchism, but if it was intended as the goal of simulating the strengths of anarchism, it would not have succeeded. Wikipedia would not have succeeded as a project as it has. But the idea behind Wikipedia and using ideas that could be construed as anarchism is one example of such a model that can be brought to be used for other uses. In this case, creating and maintaining an online encyclopedia. Can some of the ideas that are presented here be applied to other spheres for other uses? that aren't just a simulation of an economy, an intriguing direction to research. And finally, we look at the past and we look at the future here. Folks might not recognize who this gentleman is, but you certainly know what his name is. This is Louis Pasteur, the French biochemist and namesake of the pasteurization process that's used for making milk healthy. Turns out that pasteurization was actually invented for wine. It was actually patented in 1865. Louis Pasteur was actually interested in preserving and maintaining and preventing spoilage of wine and beer, and less so for milk. And when he discovered that wine and beer would spoil because of microbes inside, that it created chemicals that caused foods to spoil, he devised the process that we now know as pasteurization and patented it back in 1865. The city of Chicago, it so happened, mandated milk pasteurization and actually was the first major city to apply that. And when did it actually pass the law to require that? 1909. Do the arithmetic there. That's a 44-year difference between when a scientific discovery for a pretty important problem is discovered and when it actually is implemented on a large enough scale. And that's just Chicago. Chicago happened to be the first major city in the United States to do that. It actually would be another decade after that. What took so long? Part of what took so long was that pretty much simply the market didn't want it. Consumers didn't want pasteurization in milk because they thought it affected the taste. Producers certainly didn't want it because it would increase the amount of time that would bring milk to market, as well as the costs that would have to do to pasteurize the milk. They didn't want it either. So the market simply didn't want it, even though this was affecting the health of a lot of people, a lot of children in particular. There was an impresario out of New York State by the name of Nathan Strauss, who it turns out lost 2 sons to spoiled milk. They actually died in childhood because they drank spoiled milk. Nathan Strauss was so affected by this that he took it upon himself to campaign to basically make milk healthier across New York State and really the world. One thing that he had done is that in the 1890s, he actually established a milk lab and started giving away pasteurized milk to orphanages in New York State. Pasteurized milk was given to these orphans, and it almost immediately provided a massive reduction regarding disease and death among orphanages. In one study, a reduction of as much as 20%. And that, along with a lot of campaigning, helped to reduce that. The reason I bring this up is because just because you have a scientific discovery doesn't mean that it automatically improves the world right away or becomes widespread. I'm not choosing an abstract example, like, for example, Copernicus discovering that the sun goes around the earth. That took a long time to percolate out. Here it was much shorter, but also you would think with a much more impactful direction on people's lives, whether or not people die of a preventable disease. But the research there took time to percolate out. With regards to the participatory economy, we are now 30 years in since the original articulation of this model. The big question that we would need to answer before any kind of widespread adoption of this or anything like it would be to answer the very simple question, would this economy work? Does it do what it does without causing all kinds of hideous examples? People in the past have said, oh, just trust me, it'll be fine. And it turns out it doesn't. Here, people are fair to ask that question, and they are right to ask that question. And for at least when it comes to a participatory economy, we have been able to present some evidentiary support. We can show for one aspect of it, the participatory planning procedure, for one question of it, that of the number of iterations it takes, do we achieve a reasonable number? And the answer in these contexts so far seems to be yes. Does that mean that everyone's going to jump onto the bandwagon? Certainly hasn't thus far. Sometimes things do take time. Within the history of ideas, that kind of support for a given idea, especially if it takes a long time for it to gain credence and widespread awareness and support, can be referred to as incrementalism. But there's also a counter idea to that, that suddenly ideas that took a long time to percolate can move a lot more quickly. That's referred to as what's called critical juncture theory, that there are certain times when the planets align and everything takes shape, and suddenly you can, changes that would have taken a long time to percolate out or improve or change or whatever, can suddenly happen much more quickly in much less time and in much wider impact. We're kind of in that period now, but there's one example that I wanted to bring to bear of a conversation I had with my father and some friends of his when I was 13 years old. My family is originally from Poland, and my father lived both in Poland until he was in the late 20s, as well as in the United States after that. And I remember having a conversation with him and these friends where we were talking about the Berlin Wall as a metaphor regarding this divide between the capitalist and communist economies and their respective political alignments. Everyone in this conversation was convinced it was going to take like maybe 60 years, 70 years before we'd ever get kind of détente. It's going to be generations. This is going to take a long time before we see any kind of improvement, or even if the wall comes down. 2 years after this conversation took place, Mauer Wall happened. The wall came down. November 9th, 1989, the day of that picture. The lesson here is things sometimes take a long time, but sometimes they don't. Maybe that would happen here. Maybe it doesn't. Certainly would take more research. The work will continue. And in conclusion, of course, this is code, and here are the links for the code that was presented here. This is the GitHub repo for the PQuad CLJS, available for download now. There is instructions. The experiments that were used in the book, Democratic Economic Planning, are on my website at this link. They are in gzip files, very big, because we are dealing with tens of thousands of councils, each per economy, but they're all there. They're very big, but they're all there for research. The original articulation of PQuad and Netlogo is online here, which links to another older version as well. And for folks that are interested in learning more about the model of a participatory economy, there's now a new website named participatory-economy.org. You can go there. There's an online forum for people to discuss. Wow, have I taken a long time. I am going to close out, and I think, and that will do it. But let's move on to back to Zoom. And I was hoping to leave a lot of time for Q&A, but there's not a lot of time, 8 minutes. I kind of apologize, but there's a lot here and I wanted to get it all out, so I did. Do folks have any questions? If they don't, it's completely understandable, or if you want to discuss it later, you can. Thank you for indulging me. I did plan for 2 hours, but I was hoping to have more time for Q&A. Any thoughts from anyone? Anything anyone wanted to share? There's someone posting in the chat. Taylor says, thank you, Mitchell. This was a fascinating topic and talk. You're welcome, Taylor. And thank you for organizing the Chicago Clojure Meetup and according me this chance to give a presentation. Other topics, thoughts? Anything? Yes, Robin. Hi, Robin.
Yeah. Is my audio on?
Yes. And by the way, this is the Robin Hahnel that I've given the presentation. He's joining us on this call. Welcome, Robin. What's your question?
It's not really a question. I'm glad you took the time you took to lay all that out. And I think it's just very valuable now to have it as a resource that people can go to. Because whenever anybody asks us now about these simulations you did, well, what was the point and what did they prove or suggest? And can you really explain exactly how it was done and how anybody who wants to look into it can investigate for themselves then this is just going to be an incredibly valuable resource. It's more valuable than the chapter in the book because there's more information contained here than there is in the book.
I would argue against that, but I think it's valuable. There is some information here. I mean, for one thing, we don't really go over the code in the book, but we do here. Yeah, but the book also has the formalisms. I mean, a lot of the formalisms I presented here just came right out of the book.
But, and
so
I also
think they're both valuable for their own ways and they complement each other nicely. I agree.
But I also think that there really are some further things that should be done. For anybody interested in, you know, further exploration about the practicality of a kind of planning that is not central planning. It's not like the planning from the old communist economies of the 20th century. And it is an alternative to markets. I mean, so many people in this world assume that the demise of the centrally planned economies simply means there is no alternative, but there's no alternative to markets. And that's a sentiment that's just very deep, you know, in intellectual circles as well as popular circles. And we've been challenging that for a long time. And this is another part of the work of saying, you know, just because everybody thinks something doesn't make it true.
Yep.
And so I think further research is, I mean, I think they're solidifying this is going to, you know, requires the kind of future resource that you outlined at the end of your talk.
Yeah.
And I think at some point funders finally get convinced that there's enough here, so it deserves the further funding to sort of finish up the exploration of the practicality of a particular kind of planning procedure, which would allow people to avoid the negative consequences of central planning, communist planning, and the negative consequences of market systems, which become ever more apparent, you know, as time goes on, including climate change. So I think the presentation, as you've done it, is going to be a really valuable resource for both providing anybody that does computer work with information about what's been done in this regard, and also for convincing people that, hey, further work along this line. This is very, what should be funded is research that's proved to be promising. And what you showed is how promising the amount of research we've done in this area has already been. And certainly, therefore, that's a good argument for funding some further research along these lines.
Yeah. I maybe I mentioned this, but it bears repeating. It turns out that in counting out how many iterations it would take, in describing that out, number seems to be in the ballpark of about 5 to 7. And that's basically, at least after working out the year 1 kinks, it happens. And in fact, with the large scale examples, we fall within that threshold squarely. So yeah, that is very encouraging. And like I said, the code is all there for people to examine. We now have the algorithm spelled out. The book has been published, and the code and resources are there to explore if anyone is. And as a benefit for folks who are on this call, it's in Clojure and ClojureScript. So if you like that code, we got it. Any other questions or anything else that anyone wants to say? Evan says, can you go back to the slide with the link so I can take a screenshot? Certainly. So let me do that. Stand by. I will mute. Oh, excuse me. I will close the chat. There you go. You're welcome, Evan. Anything else from anyone? Yeah, I took 2 hours. I didn't think I was going to take almost all 2 hours in talking. Yeah, my voice hurts, but this was, yeah, not only 3 years plus of a lot of work in the code that was built in, not just with the Clojure and ClojureScript side of it, but also the antecedents in understanding the Netlogo and the algorithms thereof, antecedents that go much further back. In the case of the original publications, 30 years. A lot of that was distilled into this big talk. So it wound up being a big talk. I just didn't think it was going to be this long, but awesome.
You know, Mitchell, we should mention that we did get some funding for early parts of this research, the parts
Yes,
that
we
really
did.
funded for PQuad. And,
Yes, we did.
and that came from an outfit in Oxford, England, called the Institute for Solidarity Economics. And so we should acknowledge that.
Yes.
And we also, and people, I mean, I was teaching at Portland State University, and another collaborator on the simulations, Michael Weisdorf, was a graduate student there in their PhD program in system science. And so he had funding for this, and he's finishing up his dissertation on various parts of this as well. The other thing I would just like to add is, if you go, I mean, anybody that studied seriously, as you pointed out, Alec Nove was the world's most renowned scholar studying the Soviet economy during the 30s, 40s, and 50s.
Yes.
And anybody like him, and I studied that economy myself very thoroughly, knows that in the real world of the Soviet economy and Soviet planning, as soon as a year was over, the planning for the plan for the next year, for preparing the next year's plan, began immediately. And what we've discovered is that 6 iterations is something that workers and consumer councils themselves could easily do in the month of December.
Yeah.
Getting ready for, you know, a plan to start on January 1st for the year is something that they don't need a central planning agency to do it for them. That central planning agency used to take a whole year to come up with the plan, and this is something that they could do easily in the month of December.
Yeah.
I never, when we began this project 3-5 years ago, I never thought that the results we would be discovering would be this promising. I have been shocked. Part of what, and I think all of us were somewhat surprised, and it led us to go back and sort of check and recheck to make sure that. And the fact that we ran 40 experiments and there was just no change in the outcomes, you know,
not substantially. I mean, they were all clustering around the same.
That's right. I mean, we had thought we were going to have to do all sorts of fancy statistical tests, you know, for, you know, what is the probability that the planning would, that any particular year it would take, you know, instead of 6 or 7 iterations, it might take 20 or 30 iterations. And we kept discovering that no, there just seems to be no particular, there's no particular risk. Apparently there's no risk that you would run into those difficulties, which is why the robustness testing, I do think, is the thing that's most important from a practical point of view.
Sure.
Because you have to make assumptions to do this kind of work. And in the real world, any assumption you make is it's going to break. It's not going to actually apply. And then the question is, well, how robust is it? And that is an important area for future research.
Yeah. We are now at time. So it is now 9:02 Chicago time. Anything else from anyone that's still on the call? My website is here. I'm also available through contact on the Chicago Clojure Meetup website. You can reach out and make comments. I'm watching that as well. Yeah, I'm available if anyone wants to learn more. There's also the repos. I'm on GitHub, so if you want to follow me on GitHub, you can. And you can download the resources. There's things you can do, and I'm available if anyone has any questions or ideas or suggestions. Okay. With that, I will thank everyone for joining us, and we are going to call it night or morning. So I'm going to stop the share here. We've got video. We will post that when it becomes available, probably sometime this weekend, I hope. Yeah, we will end it here. Thanks everyone for listening and participating, and we will see you again for another Chicago Clojure Meetup soon.